The morning sun filtered through the windows of Los Angeles International Airport as passengers began boarding Flight 237 to New York. The first-class cabin, with its plush leather seats and extra legroom, was filling up with the usual mix of business travelers and well-to-do tourists. Flight attendants moved efficiently between rows, offering pre-flight drinks and collecting jackets. Captain Richard Bennett strode down the jet bridge with the confident gait of a man who had spent more than 2 decades in the sky. At 53, his salt and pepper hair and weathered face spoke of countless flights across continents and oceans. His uniform was impeccable, not a wrinkle in sight, gold stripes gleaming on his shoulders and his cap tucked neatly under his arm. The other flight crew members nodded respectfully as he passed. "Morning, Captain," said Tricia, the lead flight attendant, handing him a clipboard with the day's passenger manifest. "Full flight today. We've got a few VIPs in first class." Bennett merely grunted in response. He wasn't one for small talk, especially before a flight. His colleagues had long ago accepted his no-nonsense approach to his job. Some called him old school. Others, behind his back, used less flattering terms. What everyone agreed on was that Bennett ran a tight ship. His flights departed on time. His landings were smooth and his record was spotless. What most of his coworkers didn't know was that Bennett harbored a deep resentment toward celebrities. He had watched the airline industry change over his career, with special treatment increasingly given to the rich and famous. To him, it represented everything wrong with modern society. People getting special privileges not because they'd earned them, but because of their public profile. The old pilot believed in a world where everyone followed the same rules, waited in the same lines, and was treated with equal respect and equal strictness. As Bennett began his routine pre-flight inspection of the cabin, he noticed a commotion near the front of the plane. A tall, lean man with braided hair was being escorted to a first-class seat by not one but 3 flight attendants. Even without the distinctive hairstyle and the cloud of attendants buzzing around him, most people would have recognized Snoop Dogg instantly. The famous rapper settled into his seat with the relaxed air of someone completely at home in luxury surroundings. He smiled warmly at the flight attendants, thanking them by name. He had clearly flown with them before and chatted easily with nearby passengers, several of whom were trying not to look too starstruck. Bennett felt his jaw tighten. This was exactly the kind of scene that made his blood pressure rise. He watched as Snoop was immediately offered champagne, given extra pillows without asking, and treated with a level of attention that other passengers, even in first class, simply didn't receive. "Excuse me," Bennett said, cutting through the small crowd of attendants. His voice was cold enough to lower the temperature in the cabin by several degrees. The attendant stepped back, recognizing the captain's tone. "Is there a problem with your seating, sir?" Bennett asked Snoop, emphasizing the "sir" in a way that somehow made it sound less like respect and more like a challenge. Snoop looked up, mild surprise crossing his face. The rapper was no stranger to encountering people with attitudes, but he rarely got this kind of frostiness from airline staff, especially in first class. "No problem at all, Captain," Snoop replied smoothly, his voice carrying that distinctive laid-back drawl that millions of fans could identify in an instant. "Just settling in for the flight." Bennett's eyes flicked to the glass of champagne, then back to Snoop's face. "We haven't taken off yet. Alcohol service typically begins after we reach cruising altitude." Tricia stepped forward quickly. "Captain, we always offer pre-flight beverages to first-class passengers. It's company policy." "Of course," Bennett said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I just want to make sure we're following all proper protocols. No special exceptions." The emphasis on those last words hung in the air. A few passengers exchanged glances. Snoop, however, maintained his calm demeanor, giving a small nod to the captain. "No exceptions needed, Captain. Just enjoying the same service as everyone else in this section." He gestured to the other first-class passengers, several of whom were indeed sipping champagne or orange juice. Bennett couldn't argue with that observation, so he simply nodded stiffly and continued his inspection. But every few minutes his eyes would drift back to Snoop's seat, watching as more passengers boarded and several stopped to ask for photos or autographs. Each interaction seemed to wind Bennett's internal spring tighter. In his mind, these disruptions were precisely why celebrities shouldn't be treated like everyone else. They created chaos just by their presence. The fact that Snoop handled each request with grace and kept the interactions brief didn't register with the captain. All he saw was disorder in his carefully maintained environment. As boarding continued, Bennett overheard snippets of conversation from Snoop's corner. The rapper was discussing his upcoming show in New York, something about a special event. Other passengers were asking about his latest album and his recent business ventures. Bennett found himself growing increasingly irritated by the casual, friendly atmosphere developing in the first-class cabin, so different from the quiet, orderly environment he preferred. When Bennett returned to the cockpit to begin pre-flight checks with his co-pilot, Lee, he was noticeably tense. "Everything okay?" Lee asked, glancing up from his checklist. "Fine," Bennett replied curtly, reaching for his headset. "Just the usual circus when there's a celebrity on board." Lee's eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh, who've we got today?" "Some rapper. Snoop Dogg." Bennett pronounced the name like it was something foreign and slightly distasteful. "No kidding? My kids would flip out if they knew." Lee grinned. "He seems like a cool guy from what I've seen in interviews." Bennett made a non-committal sound and turned his attention pointedly to the instrument panel. Lee, who had flown with Bennett enough times to read his moods, took the hint and focused on his own tasks. After completing the cockpit checks, Bennett announced there would be a brief delay due to air traffic control. In reality, the delay was minimal, just 15 minutes, but it was enough to put him in an even worse mood. He prided himself on punctuality, and even minor disruptions felt like personal failures. During the delay, Bennett decided to make another walkthrough of the cabin, ostensibly to reassure passengers but really to check that everything remained in order. As he stepped back into first class, he found Snoop engaged in a lively conversation with an elderly woman sitting across the aisle. "My grandson plays your music all the time," the woman was saying, her eyes bright with amusement. "I never understood the appeal until he explained some of your lyrics to me." "Quite clever wordplay, actually." Snoop laughed, a genuine, warm sound. "Thank you, ma'am. That means a lot coming from you." Sometimes the older generation gets caught up in the style and misses the substance. "Oh, I know all about that," she replied. "People have been misunderstanding new art forms since the beginning of time. I remember when my parents thought rock and roll was the devil's music." The two shared another laugh, and Bennett felt a strange sensation watching this unexpected connection between the rapper and the elderly passenger. There was something disarming about seeing Snoop treat this woman with such genuine respect, listening to her as if her opinions on music truly mattered to him. Bennett cleared his throat loudly as he approached. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a short delay due to air traffic control. We should be underway shortly." His eyes landed on Snoop. "Sir, could I see your boarding pass again? We're doing a final verification of the passenger manifest." The request was unusual. The gate agents had already checked and scanned everyone's boarding passes, and the manifest was long confirmed. A few nearby passengers looked confused, and Tricia, who was arranging blankets nearby, paused mid-fold. Snoop, however, simply reached into his jacket pocket and produced his boarding pass without comment. Bennett took it, examining it closely as if searching for some discrepancy. Finding none, he handed it back with a curt nod. "Everything appears to be in order," he said, his tone suggesting he was somehow disappointed by this fact. "Glad to hear it," Snoop replied, his voice still relaxed but his eyes now watching the captain with more careful attention. The rapper had encountered enough prejudice in his life to recognize its various forms, from the blatant to the subtle. This felt like something in between, not openly hostile but definitely targeted. As Bennett turned to leave, the plane suddenly shuddered slightly as a catering truck bumped against the fuselage. It was a minor jolt, but enough to make Bennett stumble slightly. Instinctively, Snoop reached out a hand to steady the captain. Bennett flinched away from the touch as if burned, regaining his balance on his own. The rejection of help was so obvious that several passengers noticed, and an uncomfortable silence fell over the first-class cabin. "Just making sure you didn't fall, Captain," Snoop said quietly, lowering his hand. Bennett straightened his uniform, his face flushed. "I'm fine," he said stiffly. "Please remain in your seat with your seatbelt fastened until we're in the air." With that, he turned and strode back toward the cockpit, his back rigid. Behind him, the first-class cabin remained unusually quiet, the pleasant atmosphere now tinged with tension. Passengers exchanged glances, some confused, others uncomfortable. The elderly woman patted Snoop's arm sympathetically. As Bennett disappeared into the cockpit, Tricia approached Snoop with an apologetic smile. "Can I get you anything else before takeoff, Mr. Dogg?" "I'm good," Snoop replied, his trademark chill demeanor returning. But it seems like the captain might need something to help him relax. A few nearby passengers chuckled, breaking some of the tension. But as the plane prepared for departure, everyone in first class had the distinct impression that this flight might include more turbulence than the weather forecast had predicted. The airplane engines hummed steadily as Flight 237 climbed through the clouds. Most passengers had settled into the rhythm of air travel, some already dozing, others flipping through magazines or tapping at laptops. In first class, the initial tension from Captain Bennett's interaction with Snoop Dogg had mostly faded, replaced by the calm efficiency of the flight attendants serving drinks and distributing hot towels. Inside the cockpit, however, the atmosphere remained strained. Captain Bennett sat rigidly in his seat, hands steady on the controls as the plane leveled off at cruising altitude. His co-pilot, Lee, had made a few attempts at casual conversation, but Bennett's clipped responses made it clear he wasn't in a chatty mood. "Weather looks clear all the way to New York," Lee commented, checking the radar. "Should be a smooth flight." Bennett nodded without taking his eyes off the instruments. "Let's hope it stays that way." Once the plane reached its cruising altitude, Bennett switched on the autopilot and unfastened his seatbelt. "I'm going to do a cabin check," he announced, rising from his seat. Lee glanced at him with slight surprise. It wasn't unusual for captains to walk through the cabin during long flights, but it was typically done later in the journey, and Bennett rarely did it at all. He preferred to remain in the cockpit, leaving passenger interaction to the flight attendants. "I've got things here," Lee replied, sensing it was better not to question his captain's sudden interest in cabin service. Bennett made his way through the aircraft, pausing occasionally to acknowledge passengers with a professional nod. His demeanor was stiff but polite as he moved through economy and premium economy sections. When he reached the first-class cabin, however, his expression hardened. Snoop Dogg was reclining comfortably in his seat, headphones on, eyes closed, seemingly lost in music. Several passengers nearby were stealing glances his way, while others were engaged in quiet conversation. The scene was perfectly ordinary for first class, but something about it continued to irritate Bennett. Tricia approached him with a questioning look. "Everything okay, Captain?" "Just checking on our passengers," Bennett replied, his voice carrying more loudly than necessary. "Making sure everyone is following proper flight protocols." A few heads turned at his words, including Snoop's. The rapper removed his headphones and straightened slightly in his seat, watching the captain with calm interest. "Is there something specific you're concerned about?" Tricia asked quietly, trying to move the conversation away from passenger earshot. Bennett ignored her attempt at discretion. "I've noticed some passengers seem to think the rules don't apply to them," he said, his gaze fixed pointedly on Snoop. "I want to remind everyone that for safety reasons, all passengers need to follow crew instructions at all times, regardless of who they are." The targeted nature of his comment wasn't lost on anyone in the first-class cabin. An uncomfortable silence fell as passengers exchanged awkward glances. Snoop regarded the captain with a measured look before speaking. "Is there a specific instruction you feel I haven't followed, Captain?" Bennett's jaw tightened. Being directly challenged wasn't something he was accustomed to. "Not at this moment," he admitted reluctantly. "But I've noticed a certain casualness in your attitude that concerns me." "Casualness?" Snoop repeated, his voice remaining level despite the obvious provocation. "I'm just sitting here listening to music, same as half the plane." An older businessman 2 rows back cleared his throat. "I have to say, Captain, I've been watching, and this gentleman hasn't done anything disruptive. Quite the opposite, actually." Bennett's face flushed slightly at this unexpected intervention. "I'm simply ensuring all passengers understand the importance of following regulations," he insisted, his voice growing defensive. "When certain individuals are used to special treatment, they sometimes forget they're subject to the same rules as everyone else." The implication hung heavily in the air. Snoop sat up straighter, his relaxed demeanor giving way to something more serious. "With all due respect, Captain," he said, each word measured and clear, "I've been flying commercial for over 30 years. I know the rules. I follow the rules. What I'm not going to do is accept being singled out for no reason." Several passengers nodded in agreement, and Bennett found himself facing a first-class cabin that was increasingly united against his behavior. It was an unfamiliar position for a man used to unquestioned authority in his aircraft. "The safety of this flight is my responsibility," Bennett said stiffly, "and part of that responsibility is maintaining proper order and respect for airline procedures. And how exactly am I threatening that?" Snoop asked, his voice still calm but with an edge of challenge now. "By sitting in my assigned seat? By thanking the flight attendants? By being polite to my fellow passengers?" Bennett opened his mouth to respond but found himself without a ready answer. The truth, that he simply disliked the rapper's presence, wasn't something he could admit out loud. Tricia stepped in smoothly. "Captain, I can assure you that everything in first class is running according to protocol. Perhaps we could discuss any specific concerns in the galley?" It was a lifeline thrown to Bennett, a chance to retreat with some dignity and tact. For a moment it seemed he might take it, then his gaze hardened again. "I've received reports that there was excessive noise and disruption during boarding," he said. "That kind of celebrity entourage behavior isn't acceptable even in first class." Snoop's eyebrows rose. "Entourage? Man, I'm traveling solo today, and the only disruption I've seen so far is happening right now." Several passengers murmured in agreement, and a woman near the window spoke up. "If you're referring to people asking for photos during boarding, that lasted all of 2 minutes, and he was very polite about it." Bennett found himself increasingly cornered. What had begun as an attempt to assert his authority was backfiring badly. Worse, he knew somewhere in the back of his mind that his behavior was unprofessional, but pride prevented him from backing down. "There's also the matter of your reputation," Bennett continued, lowering his voice slightly but still audible to nearby passengers. "This airline has policies about passengers who might be under the influence of substances." A collective intake of breath swept through the cabin. The accusation was as unfounded as it was inappropriate. Snoop's expression changed then, the easygoing mask dropping completely to reveal genuine anger. "So that's what this is really about," he said quietly. "You took one look at me and decided what kind of person I am based on. What exactly? My music, my appearance?" Bennett didn't answer, but his silence was damning enough. "Captain," Tricia intervened, her professional smile gone, replaced by genuine concern. "Mr. Dogg has been a perfect passenger. There's absolutely no indication of any issue you're suggesting." Another flight attendant, Miguel, had approached during the exchange and now stood beside Tricia, his expression similarly troubled. "Sir, I think we should discuss this privately," he suggested to Bennett. Bennett looked around and finally seemed to realize how badly the situation had deteriorated. Nearly every passenger in first class was watching the exchange with expressions ranging from discomfort to outright disapproval. Even those who had been sleeping were now awake and attentive. "Very well," he said stiffly. "We'll continue this discussion later." As Bennett turned to leave, Snoop spoke again, his voice carrying clearly but without hostility. "You know, Captain, I've dealt with people making assumptions about me my whole life, but I never expected it from someone whose job is to treat all passengers with respect." Bennett paused but didn't turn around. His shoulders were tense as he made his way back toward the cockpit. In his absence, the first-class cabin erupted into hushed conversations. Several passengers leaned over to express their support to Snoop, who acknowledged them with nods but seemed lost in thought. Miguel approached with a fresh drink. "I'm really sorry about that," he said quietly. "I've never seen Captain Bennett behave that way before." "It's all good," Snoop replied, though his usual laid-back tone was subdued. "Not my first time dealing with prejudice, won't be my last. Is there anything I can do?" Miguel asked. Snoop thought for a moment. "Actually, yeah. Tell me about this Captain Bennett. How long has he been flying?" "He seems like the old-school type. 25 years with the airline," Miguel confirmed. "He's known for being strict but fair. This behavior is unusual." Snoop nodded thoughtfully. "Everyone's got a story," he mused. "I wonder what his is." In the cockpit, Lee looked up as Bennett returned, noting the captain's flushed face and tight expression. "Everything okay back there?" he asked cautiously. "Fine," Bennett snapped, strapping himself back into his seat. "Just dealing with a situation." Lee knew better than to press further, but as they continued the flight in tense silence, he couldn't help wondering what had transpired in the cabin. The captain's behavior was uncharacteristic. Bennett was typically cold and detached, not openly confrontational. An hour into the flight, the intercom buzzed. Bennett answered with a curt, "Captain speaking. Captain, this is Tricia. I have some information about one of our passengers that I think you should be aware of. Could I speak with you privately when you have a moment?" Bennett frowned at the formal tone. "Is it urgent?" "Not urgent for flight safety," Tricia replied carefully, "but important nonetheless. It concerns our earlier mean discussion." Bennett sighed. "I'll be out shortly." He turned to Lee. "Take over for a few minutes." As Bennett made his way back through the plane, he noticed that the atmosphere had changed. Passengers watched him pass with curious or wary expressions. In first class, Snoop was engaged in conversation with the elderly woman from earlier, both of them laughing genuinely at something she had said. The scene gave Bennett pause. There was something so normal, so human about the interaction that it briefly challenged his preconceptions. Tricia was waiting for him in the forward galley, her expression serious. "Captain, there's something you need to know about why Mr. Dogg is on this flight," she said quietly. "And I think it might change how you see things." Tricia led Captain Bennett to the small crew rest area behind the galley. The space was barely large enough for two people to stand comfortably, but it offered the one thing they needed most: privacy. She closed the curtain behind them and turned to face the captain, her professional demeanor masking her discomfort with the situation. "What's this about?" Bennett asked, his voice low but impatient. "I have a plane to fly." "It's about Mr. Dogg," Tricia replied, meeting his gaze directly. "And why he's traveling to New York." Bennett crossed his arms. "I don't see how a rapper's travel plans are relevant to flight safety." "They're not," Tricia agreed. "But they might be relevant to you personally." That caught Bennett's attention. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Meaning?" Tricia took a deep breath. "Mr. Dogg isn't traveling to New York for a regular performance. He's headlining a benefit concert for veterans suffering from PTSD. All proceeds go to a foundation that provides therapy and support services for vets who can't afford proper mental health care." Bennett's expression remained unchanged, but something flickered in his eyes, a momentary hesitation. "The event is called Minds at Ease," Tricia continued. "It's the third annual concert, but the first time they've managed to get someone of his caliber to perform. According to Miguel, who chatted with him earlier, Mr. Dogg is not only performing for free but also covering his own travel expenses. That's why he's flying commercial instead of private. He wanted more of the budget to go directly to the foundation." Bennett uncrossed his arms, his rigid posture softening almost imperceptibly. "I wasn't aware of that," he admitted. "But it doesn't change the fact that there's more," Tricia interrupted gently. "The reason I thought you should know is because of the connection to your family." The captain went very still. "What are you talking about?" "Your brother-in-law, Thomas. He's a veteran, isn't he? Served 2 tours in Afghanistan." Bennett's face drained of color. "How do you know about Thomas?" "You mentioned him at the holiday party last year," Tricia explained. "You said he was struggling since coming home, that he wasn't the same person anymore." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Captain, the Minds at Ease program is the same one Thomas has been attending for the past 6 months. The one you said was finally helping him turn a corner." Bennett leaned back against the wall, the revelation hitting him harder than turbulence. Thomas, his wife's younger brother, had returned from his second tour a shadow of himself. The bright, easygoing kid who loved fishing and bad jokes had been replaced by a man who flinched at loud noises and rarely slept through the night. For 3 years, Bennett had watched his brother-in-law drift further away, unable to hold a job or maintain relationships. Then 6 months ago, Thomas had reluctantly agreed to try a new veterans program in New York. The change had been slow but unmistakable. Thomas was beginning to find his way back. "Are you certain?" Bennett asked, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. Tricia nodded. "Miguel's cousin is also in the program." When Mr. Dogg mentioned where he was headed, Miguel connected the dots. "The concert this weekend is a big deal for them. Thomas is probably planning to attend." Bennett rubbed his hand across his face, suddenly looking older than his years. The implications were sinking in. He had been treating with contempt someone who was directly contributing to his brother-in-law's recovery. Bennett began, then stopped, words failing him for perhaps the first time in his professional career. "I thought you should know. Tricia said simply. What you do with the information is up to you. She slipped past him and back into the galley, leaving Bennett alone with his thoughts. Through the small window in the crew area, he could see clouds drifting past, white and peaceful against the blue expanse. The view had always brought him clarity, but today it offered no easy answers. Bennett had built his identity around following rules, maintaining order, treating everyone equally, or so he had told himself. But his behavior toward Snoop hadn't been about equality or rules. It had been about prejudice, plain and simple. He had taken one look at the rapper and made assumptions based on appearance, fame, and stereotypes. The realization was uncomfortable, a tight knot in his stomach that couldn't be ignored or explained away. Bennett prided himself on his integrity, on being straightforward and honest. Now he was forced to be honest with himself, and he didn't like what he saw. After several minutes of silent reflection, Bennett straightened his uniform and made a decision. It wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. With a deep breath, he pulled back the curtain and stepped out of the crew area. Miguel was arranging a drink cart nearby and glanced up with a wary expression. Bennett nodded to him and continued walking, making his way back to the first-class cabin. The atmosphere there had returned to normal. Passengers reading or watching movies. Flight attendants moving efficiently between rows. Snoop was looking out the window, a notebook open on his tray table. Bennett could see handwritten lines that looked like lyrics or poetry. As the captain approached, conversations quieted. The elderly woman who had been talking with Snoop earlier watched with interest, her knowing eyes missing nothing. Bennett stopped beside Snoop's seat and cleared his throat. The rapper looked up, his expression guarded but not hostile. "Mr. Dogg," Bennett began formally. "May I have a word with you?" Snoop studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Sure thing, Captain." Bennett glanced around at the attentive faces of nearby passengers. "Perhaps somewhere more private?" "Whatever you have to say, you can say it right here," Snoop replied evenly. "We've already had enough secrets and whispers, don't you think?" It was a challenge, but a fair one. Bennett inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Very well." He took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology. My behavior earlier was unprofessional and inappropriate. I made assumptions about you that were unfounded, and I treated you with disrespect. That was wrong of me, and I'm sorry." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Several passengers looked surprised. Airline captains weren't known for making public apologies. Snoop's expression remained neutral, but his eyes were evaluating, measuring the genuineness of Bennett's words. "Appreciate that, Captain," he said finally. "Takes a big man to admit when he's wrong." "I also want to thank you," Bennett continued, lowering his voice slightly. "I've just learned about your involvement with the Minds at Ease program. It's important work." Something in his tone must have conveyed the personal connection because Snoop's expression softened. "You know someone in the program?" Bennett nodded. "My brother-in-law, Thomas. He served in Afghanistan. The past few years have been difficult, but the program has been helping him find his way back." "Thomas Wilson?" Snoop asked, surprising Bennett. "Tall guy, quiet, got a scar above his right eyebrow?" Bennett stared in astonishment. "You know him?" "Met him last time I visited the center to plan this concert," Snoop explained. "He was showing some of the younger vets how to tie fishing flies. Said it helps with the fine motor skills, keeps the mind focused on something peaceful." He smiled slightly. "He's got talent. Those flies looked like the real thing." Bennett felt a lump form in his throat. Thomas and his fishing flies, a connection to his life before the war, something Bennett had encouraged him to return to for years. "He's a good man," Bennett said quietly. "Seems like it," Snoop agreed. "He mentioned a brother-in-law who flies planes." "Guess that's you, huh?" Bennett nodded, momentarily unable to speak. The coincidence, or perhaps fate, of this connection left him feeling humbled and slightly disoriented. The elderly woman across the aisle spoke up. "See? The world's smaller than we think. We're all connected if we just take the time to find out how." Her simple wisdom drew small smiles from those listening. Snoop gestured to the empty seat beside him. "Why don't you sit for a minute, Captain? Tell me more about Thomas. Always good to know more about the people we're trying to help." Bennett hesitated, glancing toward the cockpit. "Your co-pilot's got things under control for a few minutes," Snoop said. "Some conversations are worth having even at 30,000 feet." After a moment's consideration, Bennett sat down. It was unorthodox, certainly not his usual protocol, but then nothing about this flight had followed his usual patterns. Thomas was always the family storyteller. Bennett began, his voice softening with memory, could talk for hours around a campfire, had everyone hanging on every word. As Bennett shared stories about Thomas, the person he was before the war, the struggles he'd faced since returning, and the recent small victories that gave the family hope, Snoop listened with genuine interest. He asked thoughtful questions and occasionally shared insights from his own experiences visiting veterans centers. Passengers nearby pretended not to eavesdrop, but many found themselves drawn into the conversation, occasionally nodding in recognition or sympathy. What had begun as a tense confrontation was transforming into something unexpected, a moment of authentic human connection. "You know," Snoop said after a while, "Thomas is going to be at the concert this weekend. Front row seats for all program participants. Would be cool if you could make it too." Bennett looked surprised by the invitation. I hadn't planned to be in New York. I'm scheduled to fly back to LA tomorrow morning." "Plans can change," Snoop suggested. "Might be worth it to see your brother-in-law in a different setting, supporting something that matters to him." The idea took root in Bennett's mind. He hadn't taken personal time in over a year, always putting the job first. But maybe, just this once, something else deserved priority. "I'll consider it," he said, with more openness than he would have thought possible a few hours earlier. "Good man," Snoop nodded. "Now you should probably get back to flying this plane before people start wondering who's in charge up there." Bennett stood, straightening his uniform. "Thank you for your understanding, Mr. Dogg. It's more than I deserved." "Snoop is fine," the rapper replied with a slight smile. "And everyone deserves a second chance when they're genuinely trying to do better." As Bennett made his way back to the cockpit, he felt lighter somehow. The rigid framework through which he'd viewed the world for decades had cracked, just enough to let in new perspectives. It was uncomfortable but also strangely freeing. Lee looked up as Bennett returned to his seat. "Everything okay out there?" Bennett buckled his seatbelt and took the controls, a thoughtful expression on his face. "No," he said honestly, "but I think it might be getting better." The remainder of the flight proceeded with a noticeably different atmosphere. Captain Bennett returned to the cockpit with a changed demeanor that his co-pilot, Lee, immediately noticed but wisely chose not to comment on. The tension that had radiated from Bennett earlier had subsided, replaced by a quiet thoughtfulness that was unusual for the typically rigid captain. As they began their initial descent into New York, Bennett broke the professional silence that had stretched between them for nearly an hour. "Lee," he said, his eyes still focused on the horizon, "have you ever had a moment when you suddenly see yourself clearly, and you don't particularly like what you see?" Lee glanced over, surprised by the personal nature of the question. In all their flights together, Bennett had never initiated conversation that wasn't directly related to the aircraft or flight conditions. "Sure," Lee replied carefully. "I think everyone has those moments. They're uncomfortable but necessary." Bennett nodded, making a minor adjustment to their approach. "I've always prided myself on being fair, on treating everyone the same." He paused. "But I'm beginning to realize that's not entirely true." Lee didn't push for details, sensing that Bennett was working through something important. Instead, he offered, "My grandmother used to say that recognizing a mistake is already halfway to fixing it." A hint of a smile touched Bennett's lips. "Your grandmother sounds wise." "She was," Lee agreed. "Also terrifying when she caught me stealing cookies." The small joke eased the seriousness of the moment, and Bennett's shoulders relaxed slightly. As they continued their approach to JFK, he made a decision. "I'm going to request a schedule change," he announced. "Stay in New York for the weekend instead of flying back tomorrow. Can you cover for me with dispatch if they give any pushback?" Lee raised his eyebrows but nodded. "Of course. But this is unexpected. You never take personal time." "I know," Bennett said. "That's probably part of the problem." In the main cabin, passengers had settled into the rhythm of approaching their destination, collecting scattered belongings, returning seats to their upright positions, and making last-minute trips to the restrooms. In first class, Snoop was helping the elderly woman next to him retrieve her handbag from the overhead compartment, an act of kindness that drew appreciative glances from nearby passengers. When he returned to his seat, He found Miguel waiting with a folded piece of paper. "From the captain," Miguel explained, handing it over. Snoop unfolded the note, reading the neat, precise handwriting. "I've arranged to stay in New York through the weekend. If the offer to attend the concert still stands, I'd appreciate details. Also, would it be possible to keep my presence a surprise for Thomas? I think seeing a familiar face in the audience might mean something to him." "Captain Bennett." Snoop smiled slightly, tucking the note into his pocket before writing his phone number on a napkin and handing it to Miguel. "Make sure the captain gets this." As the plane touched down in New York, the usual rush of notifications and messages greeted passengers turning on their phones. Tricia passed through the cabin, making final checks, pausing briefly beside Snoop's seat. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" Snoop asked. "For how you handled everything. Not many people would have been so gracious." Snoop shrugged. "Life's too short to hold grudges. Besides, seems like the captain's got more going on than I initially thought. Don't we all?" Tricia replied with a knowing smile before continuing down the aisle. The deplaning process began, with first-class passengers gathering their belongings and filing toward the exit. Bennett had chosen to remain in the cockpit during this time, partly to complete his post-flight checks, but also to avoid creating any additional awkwardness. He had said what needed to be said, and now it was time to let actions follow words. As the last passengers were leaving, Bennett finally emerged from the cockpit. The cabin was nearly empty, with just a few stragglers gathering their belongings. Snoop had already departed, but the elderly woman who had been sitting near him was still there, carefully placing items in her handbag. She looked up as Bennett passed and reached out to lightly touch his arm. "Young man," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that comes with age, "I've lived long enough to see that the hardest person to forgive is often yourself. Don't forget that part." Bennett blinked in surprise at the unexpected advice. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll remember that." She nodded, satisfied, and continued with her methodical packing. The next morning found Bennett in an unfamiliar position, a tourist in New York with no schedule to follow. After making arrangements to adjust his return flight, he had checked into a hotel near Central Park, not far from where the benefit concert would be held the following evening. He spent the day walking the city, his thoughts circling back to the events on the plane and the conversation with Snoop. Bennett had always defined himself by his profession, the discipline, the structure, the clear lines of authority. It had seeped into every aspect of his life, creating a man who saw the world in terms of rules followed or broken, with little room for the messy gray areas of human connection. The confrontation with Snoop had forced him to see something he had been avoiding for years, that his insistence on treating everyone the same had become a shield behind which he could hide his prejudices. It wasn't equality he had been practicing, but a cold detachment that allowed him to avoid engaging with people as individuals. As evening approached, Bennett found himself standing outside the Veterans Center where the Minds at Ease program was based. He hadn't planned to visit. His intention had been to wait and see Thomas at the concert, but his feet had carried him here almost of their own accord. The building was unassuming, a converted warehouse with large windows and a simple sign. Through the glass, Bennett could see people moving about inside, some in small groups, others sitting alone. He recognized a few faces from photos Thomas had shared. The art therapist with the bright red hair, the retired sergeant who ran the group discussions, and then he saw Thomas, sitting at a table with several other veterans, focused intently on something in his hands. Even from a distance, Bennett could see it was one of his fishing flies. The material spread out before him as he demonstrated the technique to the others. Bennett watched his brother-in-law for several minutes, struck by how at ease he seemed here, how his hands moved with confidence and purpose. It was a side of Thomas he rarely saw at family gatherings, where he tended to be quiet and withdrawn, often leaving early with vague excuses. A voice beside him broke into his thoughts. "You planning to go in or just window shop all day?" Bennett turned to find Snoop standing there, dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie, looking nothing like the celebrity that had boarded the plane the day before. "I wasn't planning to go in at all," Bennett admitted. "Just ended up here somehow." Snoop nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Mind walks sometimes take us exactly where we need to be, even when we think we're just wandering." "You sound like a philosopher," Bennett observed with mild surprise. "Nah," Snoop chuckled. Just someone who's lived long enough to notice patterns. He gestured toward the center. I was heading in to check on some last-minute details for tomorrow. Want to join me? Bennett hesitated, looking back at Thomas through the window. I don't want to disturb him. He seemed peaceful. We can stay out of his way, Snoop assured him, but it might do you good to see this place, understand what happens here. After a moment's consideration, Bennett nodded. All right. Inside, the center was alive with activity. Some rooms had their doors open, revealing art therapy sessions, meditation groups, and what appeared to be a music room with various instruments. People greeted Snoop with smiles of recognition, but no fanfare. Here, he was clearly valued for his contributions to the program, rather than his fame. A woman with kind eyes and a clipboard approached them. Snoop, good to see you. Everything's on track for tomorrow. She glanced curiously at Bennett. This is Richard, Snoop introduced him, using his first name rather than his title. He's interested in the program. Thomas Wilson's brother-in-law. Her face lit up with recognition. Oh, Thomas mentions you often. The pilot, right? He's very proud of you, you know. Bennett felt something catch in his throat. He talks about me? Of course, she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He brought in pictures of your plane last month for our Family Connections project. Said his nephew wants to be just like Uncle Richard when he grows up. This was news to Bennett. He knew his sister's son looked up to Thomas, but he had no idea his own profession had made such an impression on the boy. I didn't know that, he said quietly. The woman smiled. Family connections are often stronger than we realize. Would you like a tour? I can show you what we do here. For the next hour, Bennett followed her through the center, observing the various programs and meeting the staff. Snoop had disappeared to handle his concert preparations, leaving Bennett to absorb the experience on his own. What struck him most was the absence of pity in the approach. The veterans were treated with respect and understanding, their trauma acknowledged but not defined by it. There was laughter in these rooms alongside the serious work of healing. In one area, veterans were training service dogs, their faces relaxed and focused as they worked with the animals. In another, a group was engaged in a lively debate about a book they had all read. It was a community, Bennett realized, something Thomas had been missing since returning from war. As the tour concluded, Bennett found himself back near the entrance. Through a doorway, he could see Thomas still at his table, now alone putting the finishing touches on a fly. Without conscious decision, Bennett moved toward him. Thomas looked up as a shadow fell across his work. For a moment, he stared in confusion. Then his eyes widened in recognition. Richard? What are you doing here? I had a flight to New York, Bennett said, which was true as far as it went. Thought I'd stop by. See this place you've been talking about? Thomas seemed both surprised and pleased. Why didn't you tell me you were coming? It was spontaneous, Bennett replied, finding the word strange in his mouth. Nothing in his life had been spontaneous for decades. Thomas gestured to the chair across from him. Well, sit down. Let me show you what I'm working on. As Bennett took the offered seat, something shifted between them, a new ease, a connection that had been missing in their strained holiday conversations and brief phone calls. Here, in Thomas's space rather than being pulled into Bennett's ordered world, they found common ground. This one's called a royal coachman, Thomas explained, holding up a nearly completed fly. Traditional pattern, but I've been experimenting with some modifications. Bennett leaned forward, genuinely interested. It's impressive work. The detail is remarkable. Takes patience, Thomas said, and steady hands. He paused, looking at Bennett with newfound curiosity. Never thought I'd see you here. You're usually so scheduled. Bennett smiled slightly. I'm trying something new. Being a little less scheduled, Thomas raised his eyebrows. What brought that on? Bennett thought about the events of the past 24 hours. His confrontation with Snoop, the revelation about Thomas's program, his own uncomfortable self-examination. Let's just say I had a wake-up call, he replied. Sometimes you need someone to show you that you're not being the person you thought you were. Thomas studied him for a long moment, then nodded as if he understood perfectly. Welcome to the club, he said simply, and returned to his fly tying with a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The evening of the benefit concert arrived with perfect early autumn weather, crisp and clear, with just enough breeze to rustle the trees in Central Park. Outside the venue, an old theater that had been renovated specifically for community events. A line had formed that wrapped around the block. People from all walks of life had come together for the Minds at Ease fundraiser. Veterans and their families, music fans, community supporters, and even a few celebrities who had heard about the cause through Snoop's involvement. Bennett stood off to the side, watching the crowd with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. He was out of his element here, dressed in civilian clothes rather than his uniform, without the clear role and authority he was accustomed to. He had arranged to meet Thomas inside, telling him only that he had managed to get a ticket to the show, without mentioning his connection to Snoop or his plan to stay in New York. As he waited, Bennett noticed a familiar face approaching, the elderly woman from the flight, now elegantly dressed in a blue pantsuit with a colorful scarf. "Well, Captain," she said with a warm smile. "Fancy meeting you here." Bennett blinked in surprise. "I didn't expect to see you again." "Life is full of unexpected connections," she replied. "I'm on the board of directors for the Veterans Foundation. Have been for years." She extended her hand. "I don't believe we were properly introduced on the flight." "I'm Dr. Eleanor Hayes." "Richard Bennett," he replied, shaking her hand. "I know," she said with a twinkle in her eye. "I make it a point to know who's flying my plane." She glanced toward the theater entrance. "Are you here for someone in particular?" "My brother-in-law," Bennett explained. "He's in the program." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "The ripples of war extend far beyond those who serve. Families carry the weight, too." She patted his arm. "It's good you're here. Showing up matters more than most people realize." Before Bennett could respond, the doors opened and the crowd began to move forward. Eleanor excused herself to head to a side entrance reserved for staff and board members, leaving Bennett to join the main flow of concertgoers. Inside, the theater was transformed. Soft lighting created a warm atmosphere, and the stage was set up with instruments gleaming under the spotlights. Volunteers guided people to their seats, many wearing t-shirts with the Minds at Ease logo. A simple design of headphones over a silhouette of a head, representing the therapeutic power of music. Bennett found his seat, an excellent one near the front that Snoop had arranged, and scanned the crowd for Thomas. He spotted him a few rows ahead, sitting with a group of other veterans all wearing special wristbands that identified them as program participants. Thomas looked relaxed, chatting and laughing with the people around him, a stark contrast to his usual withdrawn demeanor at family gatherings. The house lights dimmed, and a woman walked onto the stage, the same one who had given Bennett the tour of the center the day before. She welcomed everyone and briefly explained the mission of Minds at Ease, her passion for the cause evident in every word. "Many of you know that PTSD isn't just about the flashbacks or nightmares that we often hear about," she said. "It's about the quieter struggles too, the feeling of disconnection, the difficulty in relating to loved ones who didn't share the experience, the sense that you're carrying something invisible that separates you from the world you return to." Bennett saw several heads nodding in the audience, including Thomas's. "Our program uses various therapies to help bridge that gap," she continued. "Music has proven to be one of our most powerful tools. It speaks a language that can reach past defenses and connect people to emotions they might otherwise avoid. That's why tonight is so important." She went on to thank the sponsors and supporters before introducing the opening act, a band made up entirely of veterans from the program. Their music was raw and honest, songs about experiences that civilians could only imagine, but performed with skill and heart that transcended the specific circumstances. Bennett found himself moved by their performance, seeing the therapeutic aspect in real time as these men and women shared their stories through music. He noticed how the audience responded, not with pity, but with genuine appreciation and respect. After several acts, including local musicians who had donated their time, there was a short intermission. Bennett remained in his seat, not wanting to risk running into Thomas before he was ready. He watched as people mingled, struck by the sense of community that filled the theater. The lights dimmed again, and the woman returned to the stage. "And now, the moment I know many of you have been waiting for. Please welcome our special guest, who has been an incredible supporter of our program and has gone above and beyond to make tonight possible, Snoop Dogg." The crowd erupted as Snoop took the stage, his presence commanding but also somehow humble in this context. He was dressed simply but stylishly, and he approached the microphone with an easy confidence. "What's up, New York? he greeted, drawing cheers from the audience. "Before we get into the music, I want to talk a little bit about why we're all here tonight." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "I've never served in the military, never had to make the sacrifices that so many of you in this room have made. But I know what it means to feel like you don't belong, to feel misunderstood, to face prejudice based on how you look or where you come from." The theater had gone completely quiet, everyone hanging on his words. "Yesterday," Snoop continued, "I had an experience that reminded me how easy it is to make assumptions about people. I was on a flight to New York, and the captain of that plane took one look at me and decided he knew exactly who I was and what I was about." Bennett tensed in his seat, not having expected to become part of the narrative. "Now I could have gotten angry," Snoop said. "Could have made a scene, filed complaints. But instead something interesting happened. We talked, really talked, and we both learned something." Snoop scanned the audience, and for a brief moment, his eyes met Bennett's. A small nod of acknowledgement passed between them. "That captain is here tonight," Snoop revealed, though he didn't point Bennett out or ask him to stand. "He's here because he discovered that his brother-in-law is part of this program. He's here because when he was given new information, he was willing to change his mind. And that, to me, is what tonight is all about. The courage to change, to grow, to see people differently than you did before." Bennett felt a lump forming in his throat, surprised by the generosity of Snoop's framing of their encounter. "So tonight," Snoop concluded, "as we raise money for this amazing program, I want everyone to remember that healing isn't just for those who've been to war. We all have our battles, our biases, our blind spots, and we can all learn to see each other more clearly." With that, he launched into his performance, adapting his style somewhat for the occasion but still bringing his signature energy and flow. The crowd was on their feet, the veterans in the front rows looking up with expressions ranging from disbelief to pure joy at seeing such a major artist performing just for them. Bennett watched Thomas during the performance, saw how he moved to the music, how he exchanged excited looks with his friends. There was a lightness to him that Bennett hadn't seen in years. When the concert ended, the audience gave a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Snoop took a final bow alongside the program directors and the veterans who had performed earlier, making sure the spotlight was shared. As people began to file out, Bennett made his way toward Thomas, who spotted him and waved him over. "Richard, can you believe this?" Thomas exclaimed, his face flushed with excitement. "Snoop Dogg, for our little program, it was incredible," Bennett agreed. "You never told me the program had connections like this." "We didn't know ourselves until a few months ago," Thomas explained. "Hey, come meet some of the guys." Thomas introduced Bennett to his friends from the program, men and women who had served in various branches of the military and were now finding their way back to civilian life together. They spoke about the center, about their progress, about inside jokes that Bennett didn't fully understand but appreciated for what they represented: camaraderie, belonging, healing. As the group moved toward the exit, a staff member approached them. "Thomas, and you must be Richard. Snoop asked if you both could come backstage for a moment." Thomas looked at Bennett in confusion. "Why would Snoop Dogg want to see us?" Bennett hesitated. "It's a bit of a story. I'll explain later." Backstage was a flurry of activity. Crew members breaking down equipment, performers gathering their belongings, organizers tallying the night's fundraising totals. Snoop was in a small green room, chatting with Eleanor and a few other board members. He looked up as Thomas and Bennett entered, a smile spreading across his face. There they are, the Wilson Bennett family. Thomas's confusion was evident. "You know my brother-in-law?" "We met on the flight here," Snoop explained, standing to shake Thomas's hand. "Had quite a conversation." Eleanor stepped forward. "Your brother-in-law made quite an impression, Thomas. Not many people would have the courage to face their own biases so directly." Thomas looked between them, sensing there was more to the story. "What am I missing here?" Bennett placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Let's just say I wasn't at my best when I first met Snoop, but he gave me a chance to see things differently." He paused. "Much like what you've been doing at the center, learning to see the world and yourself in a new way." Understanding dawned on Thomas's face. "Wait, is that what Snoop was talking about during the show?" "That captain was you?" Bennett nodded, slightly embarrassed. "It was." Thomas stared at him for a long moment, then began to laugh. a genuine, unreserved laugh that Bennett hadn't heard from him in years. Richard Bennett, the man who lives by the rule book, had a run-in with Snoop Dogg and ended up at a rap concert. Now I've heard everything. The laughter was contagious, and soon everyone in the room was joining in. The absurdity and beauty of unexpected connections bringing them together. When the laughter subsided, Snoop raised a bottle of water in a toast. "To new beginnings," he said simply. "To new beginnings," they echoed. Later that night, as Bennett walked Thomas back to his apartment, they talked more openly than they had in years, about Thomas's experiences in the war, about Bennett's rigid worldview and how it had begun to crack, about family and forgiveness and finding your way back to yourself. "You know," Thomas said as they reached his building, "when I first came home, I kept waiting to feel normal again. Kept thinking there was some magical moment when I'd be the person I was before. But that's not how it works." Bennett nodded, understanding in a way he couldn't have just days ago. "You become someone new, someone who carries the experience but isn't defined by it." "Exactly," Thomas agreed, surprised and pleased by Bennett's insight. "The program helped me see that. And tonight," he shook his head in wonder, "tonight was something I never could have imagined." "Life has a way of surprising you," Bennett said, thinking of his journey from confrontation to connection in the span of just 2 days. "If you're willing to let it," as they said their goodbyes, with plans to have breakfast before Bennett's flight the next day. The captain felt something settle within him, a new perspective taking root, a reminder that the world was far more complex and beautiful than his rigid categories had allowed for. And somewhere in New York that night, a rapper who had faced a lifetime of prejudice and stereotyping was sharing the story of a pilot who had learned to see beyond his biases, proving that sometimes the most powerful connections happen when we least expect them, with the people we least anticipate.